I'm here today to talk to you about how to fix most of the problems that you see with CSS and you may or may not have seen in the past, and we'll go into those. I work as a UI and UX engineer at a company down the street called MuleSoft. I also run a training class for React at reactclass.com, and we have a training thing coming up if you guys are interested. Also follow me on Twitter for all things UI and React and CSS. I tweet, if you guys are familiar with the creator of Redux, this is him teaching us how to eat cereal at the React Europe conference. So fun times, fun times. So in my day job, basically I build out the component library used by about 8 or 9 different products at MuleSoft. We have a big product suite, and what we needed was a component library to basically speed up development across the board and ship products faster. And you can see that at MuleSoft, ux.mulesoft.com if you want to check it out. It's currently not open source, but eventually, hopefully it will be. So during my kind of journey building out the component library, we had a bunch of challenges that we had to conquer, and basically we had to make all of these components stand alone and work with legacy applications. So we weren't always like building stuff in React like a lot of you guys might experience. You know, you have legacy applications built in Angular, Ember, you know, maybe even older stuff like jQuery or what have you. And it's not always possible to swap those things out and start anew. So we had to basically make it so our React components could work in these legacy applications, and I can show you guys an example of that in a little bit. And we also needed to make sure that they didn't collide. So when you include CSS from external libraries or a framework, or you try to mix and mash things together, you get style collisions, and that's one of the main problems that we're trying to solve here. And then we also needed to have our styles and assets consumable by other teams that might not even be using React. And we'll dive into that. This is the obligatory CSS GIF in every presentation about CSS. Basically, if you use CSS, you might think that it's like this. You might hate it. I've been doing CSS stuff for about like 8 years now, and what I'm going to show you guys is really like the evolution of where it's going, and will make your life a lot easier. So CSS historically, like there's problems with it. It's an amazing way to style your applications, but one of the main problems is that it's in the global namespace. So if you define a class or an ID and someone else in some other, either another teammate, or if you're importing like a CSS framework like Bootstrap or Foundation, you can have side effects happen where your CSS isn't actually, like you apply a certain class and style to something and it doesn't actually work. And that might be because the CSS isn't specific enough, or something else is colliding with it and adding more styles than you didn't intend. And this has been a huge pain. And this is our future president, Donald Trump, basically stating that the CSS global namespace is the greatest threat we face today. And I agree. And we're going to solve that today. All right, so how do we solve this? We solve it by localizing our CSS, making it so we aren't putting all of our CSS into the global namespace to avoid collisions. And with React, you could do this without React. A lot of these methodologies that I'm going to talk about today, they can be used with vanilla HTML and CSS or with other frameworks. But yeah. So currently, but today I'm going to kind of focus more on the React side of things. But just know that these can apply to other kind of frameworks. So the current styling landscape, you could just write your CSS like you normally have been in your .css file. Typically, if you're doing this on a larger team, you might adopt some sort of methodology like BIM or Suit or SMAX, where basically these are ways to name your classes in such a way that you hope that you don't collide with other people. There's also inline styles, and we'll look at an example of what that looks like with JSX, which is basically like writing your markdown in your JavaScript, which may sound a little bit weird. How many people are familiar with React in the room? Okay, cool. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There's also a way to basically write all of your CSS in your JavaScript file. We'll take a look at what that looks like and the problems that it solves. And then the main thing we're going to kind of focus on is Post Css and Css Modules, which is kind of like the evolution of where CSS, in my opinion, is going. And then after this, we'll actually jump into, since we're at the static site meetup, we're going to jump into an actual static site generator that we use at reactclass.com. And I can show you some of this stuff in action. Cool. This is a repository. I highly recommend checking it out. It basically runs through pretty much every single type of way that you can do CSS with React. Very awesome repository. Yeah, so check it out. There's about, I don't know, probably like 40 or 50 different ways to do this. So people have been trying to solve this for a while. And we're going to talk about basically like the 3 different flavors of that. So the first one is inline styles. So this is a vanilla React component, and basically this is using inline styles where I just define an object, give it the CSS properties. So I'm making this purple, and then I just give that object to the style tag, and that will actually output the CSS inline into this component. It's super easy to implement. This comes out of the box with React. If you're just trying to style something very quickly, it's the way to go. You can also recompute these styles at any time. So this example right here is basically saying like if this ShamWow component is like the prop of danger is set to true, make the color red. If not, make the color black. So based off the information being passed in, or you could do it based off local state of this component, whether or not a user has clicked the button, you can swap out styles on the fly, which is pretty handy. So but there's a couple of gotchas with this. So you can't do pseudo classes or elements like before or after with CSS. There's no media queries because you basically have this object to work with, where you can just basically give it the keys of CSS values that are camel cased. You can't do important for overrides. You can't do style fallbacks for older browsers that may use a different like flexbox syntax. And then there's also like a performance implication. Especially relevant to like if you were generating a static site built with React, and the generated output would look something like this. So it's hard to debug, first of all, if you're looking at this in your development environment. But if you're building your static pages, you're going to be piping, like the user's basically downloading a much larger HTML file than they need. So there can be performance benefit or penalties for that. Yeah. And there's another kind of gotcha is there's no vendor auto prefixing. So like Moz dash whatever, or older Microsoft Internet Explorer prefixes, you can't do that with inline styles. So it depends on like what you actually need to support with your application, but just know that those are there. The second approach is CSS in JavaScript. So this is basically taking the inline JSX styling and kind of extrapolating on that. And what that looks like is this, where basically we're still writing our styles in an object, but what these libraries will allow you to do is we'll solve some of those gotchas that you run into with just the inline style approach, where basically you can apply pseudo classes like hover or focused. You can do media queries, and there's a bunch of other kind of benefits there. One of the things that you can't do, we'll go into that when we jump into Post CSS and CSS modules, but there are some limitations around doing it this way. So instead of applying this to the style tag, I'm generating a class, and we'll take a look at what those classes look like. But some of the gotchas with doing it this way, one, like you're not using CSS, you're using kind of like a mapping, a JSON or JavaScript object mapping to CSS. So you're kind of using like a subset of the language, depending on the flavor of the implementation. This is using a library called Aphrodite, which if you're going to use this approach, I would recommend this library. Basically, they all have like a slightly different syntax. Some do support media queries, some don't. Some will actually like do it with like kind of like a browser hack. So you really like when you're looking at that Git repository on a previous slide and evaluating your options, just make sure that it will support media queries. You could do like animations and keyframes. So that's another thing that inline, a lot of inline and CSS and JavaScript options don't allow you to do, is actually doing CSS keyframe animations. So you can't really leverage like the GPU of the computer to kind of do some cool stuff that CSS will allow you to do now. Like I mentioned, there might be library or flavor lock-in. So if you choose one specific thing, like there's one called what is it called? Spectrum, or no, it's called well, the Aphrodite one, and then there is man, I'm totally blanking on the name. I'll come back to that. But basically, they're all slightly different, and you kind of have to get your team to adopt all the same flavor. And then if you're gonna like back out of that later, it might be actually pretty hard to do. And then what these do is actually will apply like class names or actually inline the styles to the component. So the idea of using globals isn't really there, and I'll get into that in a little bit here of like why you actually might need to use some global CSS. There are actually some benefits. And then composing these together. So if you're defining your styles in your component, in your JavaScript file like this, how would you compose styles and reuse styles like you would in CSS? It depends on what kind of like library that you're going with, but a lot of them don't support that. There's also this kind of weird thing that happens with a lot of them, which is right when the page immediately loads, because this style gets evaluated on page load, basically it injects that style sheet into the DOM once the page is finally loaded. So the user basically could see like all this unstyled content and then see the styled content once it actually creates the style sheet in the page. So that's something to be aware of. Aphrodite will allow you to render this like on the server to avoid that, but a lot of the other CSS and JavaScript flavors don't. But yeah, so those are like the inline approaches, and if you're trying to do anything dynamic based off the state of the application or the state of like the prop being passed in, those are the way to go. But the next one that I'm going to elaborate on and talk more about is Post CSS and CSS Modules. So basically, it's not more stuff to make your JavaScript fatigue even worse. These are kind of the natural evolution of where CSS is going to solve those global issues that I mentioned before. And basically, what Post CSS is if you guys are familiar with Babel for JavaScript, Post CSS is basically the Babel for CSS, where it transforms your CSS that you've written into an abstract syntax tree, and then you can transform it in any way that you want. And there's a bunch of different plugins and stuff that will allow you to do a lot of really cool things, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit. And then CSS Modules is basically a way to take all of the classes that you're defining in your JavaScript file and localize them. And what that means is it's basically like writing a BIM-like syntax for you, so you don't have to remember to do it and make sure that you're not stepping on someone else's toes. But yeah, so again, why Post CSS? So there's a huge plugin ecosystem. You can write normal CSS like you do today, and if you're using something like Less or Sass, you can actually kind of use that exact syntax today with there's a Sass and a Less kind of syntax plugin to use. So it's pretty easy to port over to this kind of like newer setup. And like I mentioned, there's a local and global scope. And we'll take a look at what that looks like right now. So this is our typical like component architecture for our component library and in individual projects as well, where there'll be a folder of components, and this is like the button component. We have the JavaScript file, which is the actual like React source code, like creating that component class. We have the CSS associated with that test file, an index file just for like easier imports and exports, and we do examples for like documentation and what have you. But what this looks like is, it's pretty simple. I'm just creating a button component right here, and I am importing the button.css file. And this may look a little bit strange, importing a CSS file into JavaScript, but what Webpack allows you to do is basically, like Webpack can understand what that CSS file is, and with CSS modules, it will do like the transpilation for you. But basically, we have this style being imported right here, and then I'm just applying that to the class name. In React, you have to use class name because class is a reserved keyword. But I'm basically just saying like, okay, from this import, use the wrapper class. And the CSS, we'll take a look and jump back and forth. So this is the normal CSS. So I'm just writing normal vanilla CSS. I have a wrapper class with a font size and a button class. These, if you were just shipping this as normal CSS, you are probably going to run into some conflict somewhere because they're very, very generic. But we're importing these here, and here's the wrapper class, and here's the button class. What that actually will do is when the CSS is imported, Webpack and CSS modules will take those classes, so the button and wrapper class, and it will rewrite based off the file name. Well, you can customize how you actually want the syntax to be. This is the way that we do it, just the file name, the class name, and then we put a unique hash on the end of it to make sure that no one's going to mess with this unless they really, 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 really try. And this makes it so we can basically say like, okay, we're only applying these, and we aren't going to mess up any other class that exists in the existing code base or any future CSS that's being added to the code base. And the actual built output looks like this. So when this actually renders to the DOM via react.render, it takes that key off that object and just puts it on the class. So now we have our like basically BIM style CSS for free without having to kind of write and remember the kind of syntax for that. And that's versus like the Collision City version of this, which is those like really, really generic styles. If you have like a, basically like it does BIM for you, and BIM is hard because all of your team has to do it, and they have to do it the right way, and there's still like room for human error. So CSS modules will give you like a really, really nice and easy way to do this, where you're just importing your styles from your normal CSS file, applying those classes like you normally would, kind of, and then rendering that out. And that is kind of like the implementation of using Post CSS and CSS modules. There's a lot of benefits that come with this approach. So because Post CSS is the only one of the three solutions that I mentioned that will transform the CSS into an abstract syntax tree, you have this awesome power, much like Babel gives you for JavaScript, to do a lot of useful transformations to your to your CSS. So one example is you can use the future spec of CSS4 today. So you can basically like future-proof your CSS, so it can just run like natively in the browser once all browsers support that in years. But you can also polyfill Flexbox back to IE8. So if you've been wanting to use Flexbox, and if you haven't used Flexbox yet, I highly recommend it. Amazing for doing layouts. You'll never have to use floats again. It will it's pretty awesome. There's a slight learning curve, but once you get it, it's awesome. But it doesn't work in IE8. But with Post CSS, you can basically, when your CSS is being transpiled, it can apply a polyfill for you. Another useful plugin for Post CSS is an accessibility linter. So if you're using colors that don't have the right contrast, it's going to warn you. So basically CSS linting, and there's a lot of different CSS linters out there. One that I recommend is called stylelint.io. But this is one for accessibility. A key plugin, and one of the main reasons you'd want to do this is there's a plugin that basically will allow you to use initial : all, which basically means, and this is a future CSS spec, that says, okay, I want you to reset all inherited styles to this component or to this button or whatever. So any other styles that, like, before all those properties were being passed down into the children, you can basically reset them. So you just need to add initial : all in your class declaration, and Post CSS will transform that into what a browser would actually understand today, which is actually like a pretty big block of CSS. But when you gzip, all that's taken care of for you. There's also this notion of composability. So you can compose different classes together. So you're like, when you're writing your individual CSS files for each individual component, you can basically import classes and kind of compose them together so you're not repeating yourself all over the place. Another really awesome plugin that was recently released is it's one called Critical CSS Paths. And basically what this will do is, around your CSS you can define what is actually the critical rendering path of your application. So anything above the fold that the user is going to see. And it can extract that into a separate style sheet, which you can inline into your HTML. And if you look at like google.com or any like very, very high traffic site, and you look at the source code, they're inlining those styles. And that's a performance benefit where basically like you instantaneously see the styles being applied, and there's no like render blocking basically. Another useful one is separating out all media queries in your code base. So this is, if you go to this URL bit.ly /responsible.js, this is a JavaScript library that I created a while ago that emulates kind of how GitHub does their mobile site, where you can toggle on and off whether or not you want to see the responsive or mobile site. This will do it without hard reloading the page. And that's all made possible because like all of my media queries are in a separate CSS file, and I'm just like getting that like out of the DOM or disabling it. And that's something that you could do like if you basically use Post CSS and like wrap your CSS, or just like add a comment, or like, I guess it would, with media queries, it separates them all out into a separate file anyway. The critical rendering path one, you kind of have to manually say, this is part of my app that's above the fold. So yeah, so there's a lot of performance gains as well that you can get with using Post CSS and CSS modules. There's a project called Css Nano, which will minify your CSS. That also, Webpack also minifies your CSS that's built out. But the other thing that it does, and if you've ever seen a site that is using like a BIM-like syntax, especially if it has 3 or 4 classes applied to it, it gets pretty long, and we start to get into the area that we see with the inline styles, where the HTML is starting to get larger and larger. With Post CSS and Webpack, you can basically say, okay, instead of actually using the file name, the class name, and that hash, just use that hash. So again, if you look at any production like Google application or any like major site, you look at their actual markup, you'll see kind of random characters. They're doing that because they're piping down a smaller HTML payload. And like I mentioned, you can do linting in your CSS, much like you can do with ESLint in your JavaScript to keep everyone's code style consistent. And this has an asterisk next to it. This depends on like the designers on your team, but if your designers can write CSS, they can write Post CSS because it is CSS, and they don't need to learn kind of that new flavor of writing styles in like a JSON object. And GASP, the ability to use global as well. So is it all bad? No, it's not all bad. And some example use cases are, let's say, like, if everything's localized, sometimes you need to add like a body class to the page. A good example that we had is when the modal opens up, we wanted to basically, let me actually show you guys this. So basically, we have like drawers and stuff as well. Oh, okay. So it's actually on the drawer. So you can see, can you guys see that? Everything's grayscaled. Yeah. So that's only possible unless you wrote that in every single one of your localized like style sheets. You basically need to use a global class to do that. And that's the beauty of kind of using this approach, is that you can choose and mix and match which you want to use. So by default, everything is localized. So when this CSS is actually transpiled, this would be turned into that, whatever like you want to transform it into, but we use kind of that BIM style syntax. And this is a little strange at first to look at, but to make something global, you just wrap it in a global tag, or you can, if you have nesting turned on, you can basically just like put it in here, and this would be like a global class that wouldn't be transformed with that hash on the end of it. So that's actually how we're doing, and this is the CSS that we're using for that modal. So when the modal opens, we append a class to the body, and then this will actually get localized inside of the component and turn something green in this example. So you can really decide on what you want to do with it. So the question is, now you're probably asking, like, do I really need this? This is a lot of overkill. If you're working on a team, and I would highly recommend this approach, because you take away like the human error aspect of this. If everyone's importing their styles and they're being localized, then you're not gonna basically run into any naming collisions. Are you including any third-party CSS? So Bootstrap, Foundation. Are you running in, like, let's say a legacy app? So we have an Angular 1 application that if you hit a certain route, it actually loads up like what portion of the page is a React application. So that is doable. I wouldn't recommend it if you can avoid that. But that is also a good way to convince your boss to let you use React, because you can actually introduce it piecemeal and let it like take over the application. But yeah, and the answer to this question is you are running in a third-party environment because the browser, like, you don't control. So there's ad blockers, there's different browser plugins that you can customize the CSS of the page. So like if you really, really, really want your application to look exactly the way that you want it to, I'd highly recommend this approach. And yeah, like I mentioned, the third-party thing and the raw AST power. So I just scraped the surface of what you can do with these transforms. There's a ton of different plugins out there. I have I think it's postcss.parts is the website. I have a slide about it in a little bit here, where it's a huge compilation of like all the different plugins available to you, or you can write your own, much like a Babel plugin. But yeah, so if you want your styles to look correct no matter what, this is the way to achieve that. With the localized styles and the resets, with initial all, you basically are like emulating the future spec of like what Shadow DOM would be or will be. But yeah. So yeah, the real power is all in the AST. The AST is amazing, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. The other thing that you could do is like, you know, for even dev tooling, you could say, okay, I want, you know, every color that you encounter, every color rule that you encounter in our CSS code base, I want to output that into a file and analyze it. And basically you can say like, oh, you know, these 5 colors aren't in our brand style guide, or these z-indexes are wrong, or they're not using our variables, etc. So there's a lot of like tooling benefits as well, not just the actual you know, keeping everything looking the way that it should. But yeah, so you can fix CSS forever. Are you guys excited about that? Cool. Okay, so like everything's not the, you know, perfect in the perfect world. If you're doing React Native, you do have to use the like React Native create style sheet kind of syntax. It's a subset of CSS that gets applied because CSS isn't available like in native environments. But there's an asterisk there because there's nothing stopping you from taking the CSS that you've written, using that AST and transforming it into that JSON object that React Native needs to supply its styles. And I wouldn't be surprised if someone does that pretty soon. It does require a build step, but pretty much everything does. You can't really avoid that these days. If you are trying to do anything dynamic, the only way to do that with this approach is instead of swapping out the inline style, you'd just be swapping out classes like you've probably done in the past, where it's like is active. Like if the state of this component is active, apply the is active class. So you can do dynamic stuff. You would just need to write that in your CSS. Be careful of inventing your own syntax as well. So you can, like, because you can transform it however you want, you could write like your own CSS syntax that your team can't understand. There's some examples out there of like, it's kind of like a CoffeeScript style CSS. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I mean, I would be careful of doing stuff like that. And don't go like overboard on plugins. Like the more plugins that you add to your build, like the slower your build is going to get, obviously. So be careful with that. And then there's some testing quirks if you're asserting things on the localized classes, because if you're using like a random hash at the end, that random hash can be different in like the testing environment than in the actual like production or dev environment. So just be aware of that. And the worst one of them all to most people is that you have to write CSS. But I like CSS, and yeah. So which approach wins? All of them do. And this is what we use. We use Post CSS, and we also do inline styles. So where it makes sense, if we're just changing one CSS property based off the props being passed in or the state of the component, we might use an inline style there. But if it's basically like the main scaffolding of the component, we'll use Post CSS for that. Because one of the other things that I didn't really mention here is Well, it's in a slide up here. So basically, you can, because you're writing your CSS in CSS and you're transpiling that down, and it's a CSS file to the browser, you could say, okay, I want to use my CSS elsewhere. So let's say that you have a team that's just writing raw HTML or using Angular or something else, and you want them to use those classes. You could just take off that hash off of the localized style, and you basically get BIM for free, and they can use those classes. So you get some reuse with your CSS, so they don't have to reinvent and copy and paste that CSS into a separate project. It's just a separate Webpack build. That is you're putting that stuff into the global namespace, but you are kind of localizing it in a BIM-like syntax. But yeah, the other really cool thing is, and you know, we like doing everything in JavaScript these days, is like you can use variables and mix-ins, and they're all powered by JavaScript. So you might be used to writing functions and stuff in less or Sass, and it's kind of own invented language. But you can just use mix-ins and variables like written in CSS. And I'll show you guys an example of that in a second. This is the Post Css config that we have. I'm going to run through this real quickly. We use an auto prefixer, so that'll handle all browsers for us. We don't have to think about it or write that. This is the initial reset that we want to use on like the wrapper of most components. CSS, Post CSS import, so I can just use import statements just like less than Sass. The mix-ins, so this is requiring a JavaScript file, which is just functions written in JavaScript that return the style that you need. I'll show you guys an example of that. Nested CSS, much like less than Sass. Simple variables, which is just the same thing as like less than Sass variables. But yeah, and what does that look like? So once we import that into our Post CSS build step, basically we have access to use mix-ins. So the din pro, that just like defines the font faces for us. And then we have a variable called primary blue, and we can use that inside of our CSS here. But we can also use that because it's defined in JavaScript, and that's what like Post CSS. You can still define variables in and mix-ins inside of your CSS like you have been doing. But if you want to like reuse that in JavaScript, like this example, you'd want to do it in all in JavaScript. So here I'm just importing my global variables file, which is just exporting an object, and I can use inline styles here with my variables, and it's using the exact same variables that my CSS is using. So if I ever change one, it's going to propagate across the board. I don't need to like sync up two different things or have kind of like a weird build step to make both of those work. So, and we also have variables for like our Z indexes in our platform. So we can kind of keep those in sync. But yeah, so it's the best of both worlds. Some tips and tricks. If, like I mentioned before, if you're building for production, just use the hash. And this is actually what that looks like in Webpack. So it's just, you're just using the when you match a CSS file, use the style loader, the CSS loader. This is saying turn on modules, and the local ident name is what actually it'll be localized to. So the output of this would be like very much what, excuse me, what you would see on like a Google production site, unreadable kind of to the user. And this is what I mentioned before, BIM for free. So this is how you would basically say like, okay, let's give all of the CSS that we've written to all the different teams that might not be using React. We can do that by just saying like, okay, it's going to be the file name and the local name, and you can customize the local ident name however you'd like. And then this is what it would actually be. So they'd have to use these classes, and because you know, all this stuff kind of lives inside of that AST and inside of JavaScript, you could actually, and there's a really good project from BuzzFeed actually that they have have an IDE plugin for Atom and Sublime that will autocomplete classes for their developers. So you could basically like integrate these two together and like, so they don't have to remember this crazy class name. They could like have auto-completion, which is something that we're also working on. This is a module called class names. Very handy to use with this kind of setup, where basically it will combine and concatenate class names and dedupe them for you, so you don't have to really worry about that. So in this example, I'm just passing in like the localized styles for button, and then like a user-defined class name, which hopefully they've localized as well. And then just like whatever the props are. So if this is a button example, so like if the property of this is like it's a ghost button, it should be like transparent. It will apply the styles for that. And then if it's disabled, or if this is loading, apply the disabled style. And this is just like the class names module will take objects or arrays or like a bunch of different like ways to apply that. There's a lot of different ways to write this, but just a really handy module to keep in mind. Post CSS parts I mentioned to see like all of the different things that like plugins that are already made. And again, you can write whatever you want for whatever use case you have. This is a way, so like if you aren't using something like class names, if it's undefined or false, it won't like apply if you're using it with class names, the class names module. But if you're just concatenating a string and you change a class name, it could be undefined in your component. And this is just something that you add to your development environment that will like highlight or red, oh, this is an undefined class, you should fix it. A cool tip I found the other day. CSS Next is a project that will let you use CSS for today, which I mentioned. And yeah. So let's actually, so that's Post CSS in a nutshell. We can jump into questions now or wait to the end. I also have the Phenomic static site generator to show you guys. So you guys want to do questions about like the Post CSS stuff, or do you want to wait till the end after I show you the static site generator? Question. Yeah, so the React CSS modules, so a lot of the CSS and JS implementations, they will wrap your components in a higher order component, which can get weird when you're looking at dev tools. It was put together nicely, but I don't like wrapping every single component in that, because you're basically adding a bunch of compute time to your entire UI, right? So if it was just, because you're just piping down CSS to the user, like that's already done, the styles are already there. Whereas if you're like changing routes a lot, or loading a table with a bunch of stuff, you can possibly like potentially see performance hits from that. And then again, with the dev tools, you kind of don't see as much. So that's why I lean heavily towards just giving them CSS. You also like, there's a performance gain as well, because the browser requests multiple files at a time. When you're using a CSS in JavaScript solution, it typically will put it into your JavaScript bundle size. So your JavaScript that you're piping down to them is going to be much bigger. And you can do things to chunk your build and stuff, but you can just get the CSS out. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, but yeah. All right, so let's jump into the static site. How much time do we have? Okay, cool. All right, so this is our website. It is built with a static site generator called Phenomic. So basically, with Phenomic, you can build your complete, it's very much like other static site generators, except you're building the actual front-end interface with React components. So instead of using something like handlebars, you can leverage the entire React ecosystem and import any React component that you want. And basically like have a more interactive site without having to do much extra work. It leverages the React router, and it will also, which is a cool thing, will chunk your build. So it's only like requesting the JavaScript that it needs based off like the given route that you're hitting. And we can actually take a look at that. Let me try to get out of full screen here. There we go. Cool. So, and this is very much like the Gatsby static site generator. There's some differences that I'll go into. But as you can see, like these classes, this uses Post CSS like out of the box, so it'll localize all your styles for you. And this is like the production build. But if we actually look at the network tab and go to like a different route, you can see that it is requesting like JSON about that given route. So it's like loading the information that it needs when it needs it, and then it puts that in memory, and it's using Redux under the hood for managing state and what have you. But you get these like really, basically it turns your static site into a single page application where you can just like navigate very quickly. And if you've already been to a route, like that's in memory, so you can just like kind of hop back and forth. But the cool thing about it is let's take a look at some of the code. So one of the differences with Gatsby is like it's not hiding any of the Webpack configuration from you. With Gatsby, you have to, I think there's like hooks that you plug in if you want to use like a different type of loader or what have you. But with Phenomic, you basically get access to like alter the Webpack as you see fit, and you can do a bunch of like kind of performance tweaks in there. The other difference is it will, like I said, chunk your build. So the actual built output of this site, let's actually take a look at the site. Let me go into GitHub because it's hard to see this here. So there's a boilerplate that comes with it. There's a bunch of site examples as well, and the reactclass.com site is open source if you guys want to look at the source code. But basically this boilerplate here, there is a web modules folder and like basically different parts of the application that you're rendering out. And it does have the notion of page templates, where basically based off the page template you define. So we actually have, let me go back to our site. So we just have like this home page here, we have a training page and a contact us page. So they're like very different in terms of like layout and what have you. So the way that we did that is like the routes of your application, you can customize this. So like you can imagine you have this entire static site, but you also have a working React application that's hitting a server somewhere, an API. So you could like literally have your static site and a working application on the same domain using this kind of setup. But in the markdown here, I don't have any like content on this contact us page. All I'm saying is like use the contact layout, which I've defined in the like layout section, which is just basically a React component that is pinging an API when someone fills out the contact form. But yeah. And let's see, what else did I want to show? When it actually builds too, this is pretty cool. So when it actually builds, obviously it's a static site generator, so it'll build all of those different routes for you into index files. So if for whatever reason someone wasn't using JavaScript in their browser, the links would still render the pages, and search engines can index these pages pretty easily. But yeah, so basically I wanted a way to write, this is like an example, like I made this React component that's a browser, and you can give it like some text and an image. So I can like basically use that wherever I want now because it's a React component that I've imported into my project. But yeah. This is useful for like doc sites. It's useful for really any type of website that you could think of. There's a lot of good examples on their website, and also on if you check out the Gatsby website as well, there's a lot of really good examples. This is CSS Nano, that compression tool for Post Css that I mentioned. It is built with Phenomic, so if you like navigate around that site, you can kind of see like how it actually works and what have you. But yeah, the other cool thing that they're doing is they're leveraging service workers to like pre-cache stuff for even better performance, which is cool. But yeah, so that's kind of Phenomic in a nutshell. Definitely check out their site. It's in active development, and yeah, I'm gonna be building all my sites with this in the future. So, any questions on that? Yeah. I am not. I am responsible for the template that I made with React class, and I know the guy that made Phenomic. I'm just pimping it out for free because it's amazing. Yeah. It's yeah. Just the sheer fact that you can import, because there's a huge ecosystem of React components out there. If you haven't seen React.rocks, check it out. Like any type of component you could ever think of is in here. So I could basically like create a site, a static site. Let's say that it's my marketing website for my company. It also has a blog. That's kind of like out of the box with Phenomic. And then I would define like a different route that's like /app, and I could basically, import my React application, which is just like a component, and I could have this on a route and like a working application that a logged in user is on, which you can't really do that with other static site generators from the past. You could probably achieve something like this with Gatsby as well, but yeah. Isn't that amazing? No one's amazed? Are you not amazed? I believe I'm on an older version here with React class. It maps 1-to-1 with like these would relate to the pages. And this will automatically generate the route config for you. But you do have basically access to the router, and I can't remember exactly where it is. But the router is just using React Router, where you can define custom routes if you wanted. So you don't have to have like a markdown file for that. You could define that route in your React Router config as well. So it's pretty flexible in that regard. But yeah. And one of the things that like I've been experimenting with is like basically using metadata. So like on our contact page, I'm using that the contact template, which is kind of like another page template where I'm actually like defining some metadata, like the props that page is using in my markdown. But yeah, I mean, I could just write a custom page for that and put it in my router. I wouldn't necessarily need to do it this way. I just did it this way. There is a CLI. Let's see. I can't remember the exact like syntax. This is all in my like package.json. Yeah. So Phenomic start, Phenomic build. So I just have it aliased. But if I run npm, start. The other kind of benefit of this like React-driven static site generator is like I see real-time updates when I'm working on my website with hot reloading. If you haven't seen that, it's amazing. It'll change your kind of development life forever. But yeah. And there's some performance penalties with using Webpack, but they're actually working on a lot of that stuff right now. But yeah. So there is a CLI. Yeah. I don't necessarily know. The roadmap is on their site, I do believe. But I think they're working on like Maxime is really focused on the developer experience right now. So like building the actual site speeding up Webpack, making it like super easy and flexible for like any use case. And there's a ton of issues like it's very similar to like what Gatsby is also working on. I think he's trying to implement like kind of like a plugin type architecture as well. But I don't have any like official word on what they're working on. I know they just updated the service worker stuff to make it a little bit better, and they added React's router scroll position. So if you're like scrolled way down on a page, you go somewhere else, and then you hit the back button, it'll take you back to where you were on that page, which is, you know, nice. We use like, I mean, at MuleSoft, we use Node like on the back end. We're doing server-side rendering with React for most applications. You don't really need to do that though. Like my dream stack right now, and I don't know if you guys coined this or not, the jam stack. Was that you guys? Okay. Yeah, so basically my dream stack right now is like with this static site generator, you can have your entire site, your entire blog, your entire application all statically generated, and then on the back end for your APIs using a framework and like AWS Lambda and a framework called Serverless to basically manage your API and database connections where like we never have to touch a server. This is like, and this is outside of MuleSoft, this is what I do. But basically, and in that sense, you know, you have an infinitely scalable system because Lambda functions scale magically somehow from AWS, and a static site, as you guys know, will, you know, take as much traffic as you throw at it through a CDN. But yeah, this is just like statically built. This doesn't actually build out the HTML. I might actually port this over to Phenomic so it does the server-side rendering stuff for us. But yeah, typically we'll have a Node server running our API stuff, and we'll do the React render to string on the server, pipe down the HTML, and you know, our users interact with it. But with kind of like a static, it depends on how dynamic your application is, I would guess. But yeah. My question before this talk was like, I don't know how well it works with like an extremely large content base, like how long that build would take and how long the deployment would take and like the headaches associated with that. But yeah, I mean, I could see this because, I mean, just managing your own server, even if it's a Node server, like putting a load balancer in front of it, like making sure that it has enough capacity and will fail over. Same with like a database. Like this is where all these like managed solutions really shine. And like basically when I found out about AWS Lambda and serverless, I was like, wow, like I can just never have to deal with that ever again. I don't have to mess around with Docker, set up my own containers, set up my own, yeah. It just simplifies the process tremendously once you get over the learning curve of like AWS like roles and Lambda and yeah. But there's a lot of different solutions that are coming out. I think a lot of companies are going to start to move in that direction. It's almost like a microservices setup. The challenge that I see with that is if you have, you know, instead of having microservices running on these node instances or whatever, now you have these like even smaller functions that do one thing and do them really well. How do you like visualize your actual system and keep it like sane? I think that's one of the biggest challenges, at least on the API side of things. Like the static site stuff, yeah, I think there's a lot of good solutions out there now. Yeah, the main difference that I saw, and I haven't built a site in Gatsby, but when I was evaluating the two, I basically was trying to figure out like how to configure a specific like Webpack loader, and with Gatsby, it doesn't give you direct access to that. You would have to go into the internals and like fork it or tie into one of their like hooks basically to alter that. and I just heard there's some like weird workaround hacks that you have to do. So that's why I kind of went with Phenomic, because like I've been working with Webpack for a while, and it's extremely powerful. One of the things that we do that I can show you guys is like, so this static site that we actually we deploy. So this component playground, which is like actually like a live code editor and what have you, where I can just like change stuff and see it. This is for like developer consumption to see how to use the different React components and what have you. But the build, we chunk the build. So when you actually hit this site, you're not downloading everything all at once, because it would be like a pretty large file because we have a ton of components. We use Webpack to chunk that build, where it will like basically figure out based off your routes, or you can specify like how you want it to be chunked. It will build those into smaller pieces, and then only when you hit those specific routes will those chunks be loaded. Which is a good way to basically like improve performance. Yeah, thanks.